So last week we talked quite a bit about the training process on Camino and how Camino prepared the Grand Army of the Republic for the Clone Wars, be it training or equipping them with vehicles and equipment from across the galaxy. But I figured today we could talk about one piece of equipment that actually was manufactured entirely on Camino. Let's discuss Clone Trooper armor, how it worked, and just the armor set in general. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, I've actually done some videos on Clone Trooper armor in the past, and primarily focused on Phase 1 versus Phase 2, or the transition from Phase 1 to Phase 2. Today I want to just talk about the armor set in general, and what the Clone Troopers thought of it, a bit about how it worked and its legacy. So, let's kind of start with some of the basics. It was manufactured on Camino by Kaminoan defense contractors, who were responsible for creating some of the equipment used by the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, a lot of that equipment was shipped in from across the galaxy, but the armor in particular was manufactured on Camino, and it was actually kind of fairly easy to manufacture as far as armor goes. Unlike basically any other faction in galactic history with a biological military, the Grand Army of the Republic consisted entirely of identical clones, meaning they didn't have to worry about different sizes or body shapes. They could just make one set of armor and basically copy and paste it a whole bunch. They had to perfect one suit of armor and design it for one single body, and they just kept making that. And even then, the Kaminoans struggled there. While the Kaminoans were incredibly talented cloners, they were not the best armor smiths, and the first versions of Clone Trooper armor were not the best. While they felt very natural to clone troopers who had trained in them all their lives, they were ultimately rather uncomfortable and clunky. That being said, they did have a lot of features. So in general, Clone Trooper armor, both Phase 1 and Phase 2, consisted of a black body glove that encompassed the whole body, and then on top of that, white plastoid armor would be mounted to provide protection. Now, it's worth noting that this protection is not against blaster fire, but instead against harsh environments and shocks and blows. It would be fairly effective, for example, at protecting the wearer against, say, a nearby explosion, but not necessarily offer that much protection against direct blaster fire from an enemy firing at you. So there's this sort of misconception that comes up a lot with Stormtrooper armor, where the armor doesn't seem to protect against getting shot, but it's not really what it's designed for. The helmet provided all kinds of information, like a heads-up display to the wearer and information about nearby units, a tracking system which could be used to monitor troops' position on the battlefield, which, by the way, feels like a bit of a vulnerability. If an enemy was to get a hold of that tracking system, they'd be able to track your movements, so I'm not certain about that feature as whether or not it was a good idea, but it was in there. And the helmet also held a fairly complex air filtration system that would allow the wearer to survive brief periods of time in a vacuum, and be able to operate in environments that were smoky or filled with hazardous chemicals or gases. It should be fairly obvious here, but I think it's still worth mentioning that the original version of the Clone Trooper armor, the Phase 1 Clone Trooper armor, was based off of the Mandalorian armor worn by the original clone template, Jango Fett. However, as the armor progressed to Phase 2, some of that resemblance of Mandalorian armor started to fade, and let's talk a little bit about Phase 2, because that was primarily Phase 1. Phase 2 was far more comfortable and far lighter, making a much more functional experience for the Clone Trooper wearing the armor, which is a big plus when you're fighting on diverse battlefields around the galaxy. That being said, it wasn't without its costs. It did sacrifice the complex breathing apparatus that was built into the helmet in the Phase 1 armor, and instead replace it with mounts for an external breathing apparatus, which could be added in the event that they needed to venture into more hazardous environments. Now, the helmet on its own could still protect against particulates and some less intense chemicals, but if you were going into a biological hazard situation or operating in the vacuum of space, you would need a special rebreather mounted to the outside of the Phase 2 helmet. Well, the Phase 1 could operate in both those environments for at least a short period of time. That being said, the Clone Troopers seem to vastly prefer Phase 2 over Phase 1. Now, there are a few more things that both sets of armor had that are kind of standard and should be obvious, like complex communication equipment. They both had complex radios that allowed the troopers in the helmets, or the outfits as a whole, although the communication system was in the helmet, to communicate with soldiers across the battlefield or communicate with commanders that were giving orders to clone forces moving around the engagement area. They also held pouches primarily on tactical belts for a variety of different uses, and this could include things like additional ammo for the DC-15 blasters that were being used by the Republic at that time, some spare food rations, although those would often end up in the backpacks that were attachable to the back of the armor, and additional things like thermal detonators and binoculars to be used in specific combat instances. Ultimately, this armor would end up being very highly regarded by the soldiers that wore them, but not by basically anyone else. After all, it was tailor-made for Jango Fett and his clones, so anyone that wasn't a Fett clone wearing this armor might find it a tad bit uncomfortable. Still, it has the unique distinction of being one of the few bits of kit designed for the Grand Army of the Republic that was actually manufactured on Kamino, and even then, it wouldn't survive much beyond the war. With the retirement of the Fett clones, it'd be replaced by Stormtrooper armor, and we'll dive into Stormtrooper armor later this week and talk about how that armor worked and compare it a little bit to the Clone Trooper armor. But with all that being said, even though the armor might have been a little bit uncomfortable, especially in its earlier phases, the armor was still fairly successful and beloved by the Clone Troopers who spent their whole lives training in it. If you'd like to learn more about how the Clone Troopers were prepared for battle on worlds that were dramatically different from Kamino, I'll leave a link up here to my video breaking down some of the little secrets about the training facilities at Tipoca City that were used by the Grand Army of the Republic to prepare them for the Clone Wars. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments what you think of clone armor as a concept. Do you think it makes sense to manufacture this armor on Kamino, or do you think it really should have been outsourced to a more professional armor manufacturing firm with a long history of manufacturing armor, as opposed to being something that the Kaminoans took up on their own? And if you have anything else like to see me cover in Star Wars or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.